Have you ever imagined being accused of something terrible without having done anything at all, and worse, to be judged without even having the right to defend himself? This is what happened to Camila, a young orphan who, even carrying the weight of a difficult past, found a chance to start over when she was hired as a nanny by a wealthy family. Dedicated, loving, and tireless, she created a special bond with little Lucas, who is only 3 years old. But everything changed brutally when an anonymous complaint of mistreatment fell like a bomb on that house. Without evidence, without investigation, Camila was fired and humiliated in front of everyone. Have you ever been in a situation where your word just hasn't been heard? Leave your like, subscribe here to the channel, and come with me, because what happened after this injustice will move you in a way that you may not even imagine. Camila was only 19 years old, but she already carried a weight on her back that many people would not bear in a lifetime. Orphaned since she was a child, she grew up among shelters, distant looks, and empty promises of temporary families that never became permanent. With each change of house, a new frustrated attempt to belong, and with each farewell, another piece of hope was lost in the silence. She learned early on not to expect too much from others and to rely only on herself. But even in the face of so many losses, there was something that no one could take away from her. The dream of one day having a safe place, a corner of her own, where she could finally be accepted and build a dignified future. When the opportunity arose to work as a nanny in the home of the respected Mr. Augusto and the elegant Donna Beatriz, Camila felt her heart race. It was more than a job. It was a real chance to change my life. For the first time, she would walk through the gates of a mansion that until then she had only seen from afar, with its perfectly designed gardens, the large glass windows reflecting the clear sky, and an imposing facade that seemed to whisper, "Here everything is in order." Every detail of that place exuded sophistication. Soft rugs, chandeliers that looked like stars stuck to the ceiling, classic design furniture, and an organization that bordered on the impeccable, but nothing there impressed Camila as much as the children. From the first contact, she felt a different warmth welling up in her chest. There was in the eyes of the little ones a mixture of innocence and curiosity that completely disarmed her. The youngest, Lucas, only 3 years old, was the one who became most attached to her. It only took a few minutes for the boy, with his big eyes full of life, to extend his arms, as if he already knew her from other lives. He soon began to affectionately call her Cami, in a sweet tone that melted any resistance. Camila gave herself body and soul to the work. She prepared meals with affection, organized toys patiently, told stories before bed, sang soft songs while cradling Lucas in her arms, until sleep came. Every smile from him was like a prize, every hug a silent confirmation that he was on the right path. Even small children's tantrums were seen by her as part of learning, something natural in the growth of any child. She treated them not as a service but as a mission. Donna Beatriz, elegant and always well-groomed, initially watched from a distance. Over time, however, she began to relax and even confided to some friends that she had never seen her children so well cared for, so serene. Gradually, she allowed Camila to participate more in the routine of the house. The young woman became a constant presence at Sunday lunches, accompanied the children to school appointments, and sometimes even helped with small household chores when the other employees were busy. Inside that house, Camila experienced, perhaps for the first time, the sense of belonging. Despite the hectic routine of the mansion, there were moments of peace that Camila kept as small treasures. The mornings when she took Lucas to the garden and watched him run among the flowers laughing were her favorite moments. There, under the soft sun and the aroma of fresh plants, she felt that she had finally found a place in the world. Each gesture of trust from the children fed the hope that who knows, that work could turn into something bigger, into a new family. But while Camila immersed herself in this new chapter of her life, not everyone inside the house observed her. Dedication with good eyes. There were looks that, although smiling on the outside, carried something unsettling on the inside. Small, muffled conversations, whispers that ceased when she approached, quick expressions of judgment disguised in the midst of the elegant routine of the house. Camila, always attentive, noticed the small signs but chose to ignore them. She didn't want to allow insecurities to come back to haunt her just now, when she finally seemed to have found a safe haven. Even with this discreet tension in the air, Camila continued her work with even more zeal. He knew he couldn't afford to make mistakes. Her past already carried the stigma of being an orphan, someone without an important last name, without roots or influences. Now all he had was his dedication and the pure bond he built with those children. Each day in the mansion represented a new chance to prove that she was trustworthy, that she could be something more than fate had in store for her so far. Still, even with all this delivery, there was something invisible moving behind the scenes. Silent forces began to act, preparing a coup that Camila could never have foreseen. The same walls that now seemed to shelter her would soon witness a painful turnaround, capable of putting everything she had built at risk. If you're enjoying this story, leave your like below, subscribe to the channel to follow the next parts, and write here in the comments of which city you're watching. The routine that once seemed serene and predictable was beginning to show subtle signs of change. At first, they were almost imperceptible details, small gestures that could easily go unnoticed by those who were not attentive. Camila, with her instinct already shaped by years of uncertainty and rejection, perceived the changes as a discreet cold that begins to invade the house when the wind changes direction. There were fleeting glances from some employees, conversations that stopped abruptly as soon as she entered certain rooms, muffled whispers in empty corridors. Even her neighbors, always so cordial, began to greet her with less enthusiasm, as if something were hanging in the air, invisible, but heavy enough to alter the atmosphere around her. Donna Beatriz, who used to show so much satisfaction with Camila's work, also started to adopt a more reserved posture. His praise became scarce, his expressions more closed. She, who had previously talked lightly and even shared confidences about raising her children, now seemed to mince words, as if keeping an uncomfortable secret. The smile that once expressed gratitude and trust now seemed forced, like a socially protocol gesture, free of any true warmth. However, among all the faces that passed through that house, there was one in particular that aroused in Camila a discomfort that was difficult to describe. The boss's brother-in-law, Mr. Ricardo, appeared more and more frequently in the corridors of the mansion. Always well-dressed, with that wide smile that tried to mask something behind his eyes, he exuded a kind of presence that bothered in a subtle and persistent way. It was not what he said, but how he said it. The disguised jokes, the comments about how too dedicated Camila was, the lingering looks while she played with the children in the garden, all made up an atmosphere charged with something she couldn't name, but that made her keep a respectful distance. The most disturbing thing was the way Ricardo approached the children in the absence of their parents. He suddenly appeared at times when he shouldn't be there, offered sweets, insisted on jokes. That seemed innocent at first glance, but carried a discomfort that Camila felt in the back of her stomach. Luke especially seemed to react in a confused way. Sometimes the little one accepted the treats with a forced smile. At other times he looked away, hugged Camila, and remained silent, as if seeking refuge in her presence. In the mornings following some of these unexpected visits, Camila noticed changes in Lucas's behavior. The boy, always so lively and talkative, woke up agitated, with deep dark circles under his eyes and an evident tiredness in his eyes. He cried for no apparent reason, refused breakfast, and showed an unusual irritation in the face of the small daily routines. She welcomed him with the same affection as always, trying, in her silence, to understand what was behind that sudden anguish. When she questioned him gently about what was happening, Lucas just hugged her tightly, and with a choked voice asked her not to leave him alone. Camila, as much as she felt the discomfort growing inside her, avoided commenting any suspicion with the bosses. She knew that, in her position, any misinterpreted insinuation could backfire on her. Her history, marked by the absence of a family of reference, placed her on a thin line of constant distrust. There was no one to defend her, in case the words were distorted, so she preferred to stay focused on her work, taking care of the children with the same dedication as always, in the hope that perhaps she was just being overwhelmed by unfounded insecurities. However, the frequency of Ricardo's visits to the house began to exceed the limit of what is acceptable. At unusual times, he would come up with vague justifications, such as bringing a gift for his nephews, or keeping his sister company while his brother-in-law traveled for work. In the eyes of those who observed from the outside, he was an affectionate and present uncle. But Camila noticed the moments when he appeared in the rooms where she was alone with the children, the discreet footsteps in the corridors, the muffled whispers, the half-open doors behind her. The accumulated tension began to affect Camila's own work. Even though she maintained her usual discipline, smile and care, her sleep became lighter, her thoughts more restless. The nights were permeated with worry. What if something was really happening? What if your intuition was right? But what could it do? Denounce? Accuse? With what evidence? Who would you trust? Each possibility seemed more dangerous than the last. The days dragged on under this blanket of unrest. While the facade of the house remained impeccable, the gears behind that perfect routine turned laden with distrust and unspoken fear. Camila, although with a heavy heart, chose silence, clinging with all her strength to the pure bond she had built with Lucas. It was for him that he stayed. It was there that he found the strength to face each day, even under the increasing weight of a silent tension that now contaminated every corner of that mansion. But what had begun as barely perceptible signs was about to take shape. An unexpected move was afoot, about to plunge Camila's life into an even more devastating storm. The morning dawned with a strange silence, as if the house, accustomed to the soft noise of children and the coming and going of employees, sensed what was about to happen. Camila, as usual, was already up very early, preparing the children's breakfast and organizing the day. I didn't imagine that this would be the last coffee I would serve inside that house. As I placed the cut fruit in the colorful bowls and arranged the juice on the table, I felt a tightness in my chest that I could not explain. There was something in the air that bothered her, but as on so many other occasions, she preferred to ignore the discomfort and continue with her usual smile. However, right after breakfast, Donna Beatriz appeared. He did not have the usual friendly countenance, nor the polite smile that he used to offer even on the busiest days. His eyes were cold, hard, as if carrying a sentence already decided. Without beating around the bush, she ordered Camila to accompany her to the office where the environment carried a suffocating weight. The sweet scent that normally filled the room now seemed dense and cloying, mixed with the tension-laden air. There, bluntly, Donna Beatriz announced that she had received an extremely serious anonymous complaint. Someone, supposedly, had reported that Camila had been mistreating the children. The accusation sounded absurd, unthinkable, completely opposite to everything she had dedicated to those children. But Donna Beatriz spoke with the coldness of someone who had already made her decision, even before hearing any defense. There was no room for explanations. There was no listening. The words were harsh, swift, and relentless. Camila tried to argue. The tears flowed immediately. Her choked voice tried in vain to find a space between the dry accusations. She begged, asked only to be listened to check, to talk to the children, to the other employees, but none of her words seemed to cross the wall of ice that rose before her. The scene seemed surreal, like a nightmare from which she could not wake up. Tears flowed uncontrollably, while the unfounded accusation was reaffirmed more and more firmly. The employees of the house, who until then shared the corridors with her every day, now looked at her differently, with eyes full of judgment, as if in a few minutes her entire story had been rewritten. Camila felt the ground disappear under her feet, her heart beating out of rhythm, as if the very air was being ripped from her lungs. With no alternative, she was forced to pack her things. He carefully placed his few clothes and personal belongings in the small battered suitcase he had been carrying since his days in shelter. Each folded piece felt more like a blow, a cruel reminder that no matter how hard she had tried to build something solid, everything could be brutally torn from her. The steps to the door of the mansion were heavy and dragged, while the accusing eyes of the others followed her in silence, like silent witnesses of an injustice that no one dared to dispute. The moment he crossed the exit door, the most painful sound echoed behind him, Lucas's desperate crying. That little being, with whom he had built such a pure bond, cried intensely, extending his arms and shouting the affectionate nickname he had always used, "Cammy! Cammy!" The child's wail pierced through Camilla like a knife, leaving an open wound that would bleed for a long time. It was the cry of someone who, even without understanding what was happening, felt that something deeply wrong was going on. As she set foot on the street, the cold morning air touched her face, bringing with it an overwhelming loneliness. The mansion, which until a few hours ago represented hope and a new beginning, was now left behind as a symbol of betrayal and injustice. Camilla walked aimlessly, trying to hold back her tears, but the tears kept falling. Once again, like so many others in her short life, she found herself alone, without a defense, without a safety net, carrying the weight of accusations she did not commit. What Camilla didn't know, as her tears mingled with the wind of that bitter morning, was that this complaint had not come about by chance. Behind the cold and cowardly accusation, there was a carefully articulated strategy, planned behind the scenes by someone who had been watching her for a long time with vested interests. Someone who saw in her presence an imminent risk to his own secrets and who, to protect himself, devised a cruel plan to remove her for good. The anonymous tip was just the tip of a dark iceberg that was beginning to emerge, threatening to destroy not only Camilla's reputation, but also everything she had managed to build with so much effort. As she walked through the streets of the city, with the small suitcase in hand and her heart in pieces, Camilla tried to reorganize her thoughts, to understand where she had failed, what she could have done differently. But deep down, a lingering feeling whispered in his chest. This story wasn't being told in the right way. There was something behind that complaint that she still couldn't fully see, but that sooner or later would come to light. Even shaken, there was a small flame inside her that insisted on not going out, a silent force that, even fragile, kept her hope alive. On the other side, inside the now silent mansion without the presence of Camilla, the consequences of that act began to take shape unexpectedly. The children, especially Luke, felt his absence in a devastating way. The little one, unable to understand the complexity of the events, only felt the emptiness left by the one who had always welcomed him with so much affection and protection. The constant crying and the requests for her nanny echoed through the corridors of the house, while Donna Beatrice, still firm in the decision she had made, began to be invaded by a discomfort that insinuated itself in her thoughts, like a growing discomfort that she could not completely remove. The set was set, the pieces were in motion, and what seemed to be the definitive end for Camilla, in fact, was just the beginning of a sequence of events that would drastically change the course of that story. Camilla disappeared, as if erasing herself from her own existence. With no family to support her, no trusted friends, no place to seek consolation, she took refuge in the anonymity of a distant neighborhood, in a simple boarding house, almost forgotten by the city. The small room with peeling walls and antique furniture had become his only shelter, a space where he tried to rebuild little by little the shattered pieces of his dignity. The nights were long and heavy. The silence of the new home brought no peace, but it echoed Lucas's cries that still resonated in her mind, as if each stifled call of the boy was a cruel reminder of the injustice that had torn her from his life. Each morning was a battle against the urge to give up. She awoke with the weight of a guilt that did not belong to her, with the open wound of an accusation that had stained not only her name, but also her soul. As much as she tried to move on, the absence of the children's smiles, the emptiness of Lucas's little arms that used to wrap around her with such affection, made any real attempt to forget impossible. He carried within him the pain of the torn noose, the living memory of a relationship built with love and honesty, now interrupted in a brutal and cowardly way. While Camilla struggled in silence with her own demons, in the mansion, her absence began to slowly erode the balance that existed in the routine of the house. The apparent order and luxurious comfort were not able to fill the void left by the young nanny. The children, who had previously been filled with joy by his affectionate presence, now wandered through the rooms without the same sparkle in their eyes. Little Lucas, in particular, sank into a deep restlessness that was difficult to control. His spontaneous joy disappeared as if it had been erased. The nights, once quiet under the lullaby of Camila's stories and songs, turned into long periods of insomnia, accompanied by constant crying and nightmares that made him wake up screaming her name. Donna Beatrice, who had initially made her decision with the coldness of someone who believed she was protecting her children, began to be invaded by an uncomfortable doubt. Every tear of Luke, every plea in his sleep, every morning when the boy woke up with his eyes swollen from crying, planted a seed of questioning in his mind. Had he made a mistake? Had it been hasty? Did he really know the truth? The days became heavy. Lucas's anxiety crises increased, accompanied by behaviors that did not exist before. He refused to eat at some meals, remained silent for long periods, and at other times burst into fits of crying that his parents could no longer control. Attempts to distract him with new toys, outings, or expensive gifts proved futile. Nothing could replace what he had lost. Camila's absence was not only physical, it was emotional, affective, irreplaceable. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere that was once one of comfort and prestige now carried an invisible weight. The employees walked in a restrained manner, avoiding prolonged conversations and keeping the routine on autopilot. There was a collective embarrassment in the air, as if everyone knew deep down that something had been deeply unfair, but no one dared to say it out loud. Camila's name was no longer mentioned, but it hovered like a silent ghost in every room, in every corner of that house that now seemed too big to contain the installed discomfort. Mr. Augusto, busy with his business trips and worried about his son's emotional health, was also beginning to be taken by concerns. He watched the suffering of the little one with increasing impotence, but he trusted his wife's decisions, believing that she, as a mother, would know what was best. Still, she could not ignore the fact that, since the sudden departure of the nanny, the emotional balance of the son was shattering day after day. Donna Beatrice, in turn, tried to maintain a firm appearance in front of her family, but in her heart, the doubts already haunted her. The moments of loneliness were taken by uncomfortable memories of the conversation with Camila on the day of her dismissal, of the young woman's desperate plea, of the tears that ran down her face as she begged to be heard. As much as she tried to push these images away, they came back every night when the silence of the house allowed her own thoughts to scream inside her. And, as Lucas's suffering intensified, so did the feeling of guilt muffled within Donna Beatrice. She began to wonder if she had not been manipulated by distorted information, if she had given in to the pressure of an anonymous complaint without seeking the truth with the care that the case demanded. The unanswered questions corroded her, planting a restlessness that prevented her from finding true rest. Camila, distant, continued to try to survive. He had found a small temporary job in a local laundromat that guaranteed him the bare minimum to pay for a simple room and a few meals a day. He dared not seek new work with children, fearing that the accusation would tarnish his reputation at any new opportunity. He carried with him the constant fear that that episode had forever marked his name, making it impossible to go back to doing what he loved most. The nights, however, continued to be his biggest challenge. Lying in her simple bed, she stared at the dark ceiling and let her mind wander, revisiting every detail of the accusation, every word spoken on that fateful day. He tried to understand where such cruelty had come from. Why would anyone do that? Who would benefit from its fall? The more he thought, the more he lost himself in a labyrinth of hypotheses, not realizing that the answer was already silently close by, just waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. As time passed and Lucas's suffering increased, a new piece began to move in the hidden puzzle of this story. And even if she didn't know it yet, Camila's fate was about to intertwine, again with that family's, in an unexpected and profound way. Time seemed to advance with an unbearable weight inside that house. The weeks dragged on, and Camila's absence not only left an emotional void, it seemed to have unleashed a spiral of suffering that no one could contain. Lucas, once so full of life, had now become a shadow of the cheerful boy who walked the corridors of the mansion with the hurried steps of someone who discovered the world every day. His eyes, once bright, carried an early tiredness, as if childhood was being stolen slowly in front of everyone, without anyone knowing exactly how to stop that silent process. Food refusal became one of the first alarming signs. The boy, who loved the meals prepared by Camila, began to reject the still full plate, pushing the food with his fork without touching what was served to him. Even favorite sweets, which once drew easy smiles, are now ignored. The toys, which had once filled his days with adventure, now lay untouched in the corners of the room, gathering dust. Lucas clung only to a small teddy bear that Camila herself had given him on one of her birthdays. It was as if that object was his last connection with a time of security and affection that had been brutally ripped from him. The despair of Donna Beatrice and Mr. Augusto grew every day. Attempts to re-establish the routine came up against his son's growing apathy. Doctors were called, several tests performed, but no physical problems were identified. The reports were always the same. Lucas's physical health was preserved, but his emotional state showed signs of strong psychological distress. The frustration of the parents became visible in every exhausted expression, in every exchange of looks loaded with helplessness. No matter how hard they tried, they could not reach their son in that silent and deep suffering. The nights became even more distressing. Lucas would spend hours awake, tossing and turning in bed in a cold sweat, until sleep overcame him by sheer exhaustion. And even when he finally fell asleep, he was overcome by recurring nightmares. He often woke up in the middle of the night, with teary eyes and accelerated breathing, repeating the same name insistently, like a desperate whisper that echoed through the silent corridors of the mansion. Cami, Cami. The constant appeal tore the heart of Donna Beatrice, who could no longer find answers within herself. The presence of Ricardo, the brother-in-law who continued to frequent the house regularly, began to gain contours of even greater discomfort. His visits, previously covered with cordiality and family pretexts, began to be perceived with a strange weight. The lingering glances at Lucas, the attempts to get closer to the boy, the comments always disguised as excessive concern, generated a restlessness that, initially muffled, began to grow within Donna Beatrice like an uncomfortable suspicion. Still, without a defined form but impossible to be ignored, with no alternatives, they decided to seek specialized help. It was then that they turned to a renowned child psychologist, known for her delicate work with children facing trauma. The first few sessions were a challenge in themselves. Lucas barely interacted, remained silent for long periods, or limited himself to drawing circles and disconnected strokes with the colored pencils arranged on the small table in the office. At other times, he just repeated Camila's name in a low tone, as if that was the only thread of security that still kept him connected to what was once his happy routine. The professional, experienced and patient, did not force the boy. He respected his silences, observed every gesture, every expression, every choice of color in his drawings. Over time, he created a space of trust where, little by little, Lucas began to show clearer signs of anguish. During some playful activities, whenever the theme of pain or fear came up in the stories told, an unsettling pattern began to take shape. When asked indirectly about who made him sad or who did the dodoi, Lucas did not answer verbally. His eyes, however, invariably drifted towards a small picture frame placed in the living room, where there was an enlarged family photograph in which Uncle Ricardo also appeared. The psychologist began to notice the consistency of this pattern. It was as if, even without being able to express it in words, the boy tried to point out the origin of his suffering through that fixed and uncomfortable look. In each session, the discomfort gained more clarity. With each new exercise, Camila's name was loaded with nostalgia and security, while the indirect mention of pain led Lucas's fearful gaze always to the same image. Faced with this constancy, the professional expanded her notes, carefully observing what seemed to be a delicate and dangerous line of emotional investigation. In her experience, she knew that children at this age often resort to indirect mechanisms to try to communicate traumas that they are not yet able to process verbally. And everything indicated that there was something hidden behind that silence. Of the boy. The following sessions followed the same dynamic. Lucas kept his silence heavy, interspersed with some drawings that revealed, in a subtle way, figures of adults and children in uncomfortable positions. In one of the drawings, he drew a large, dark figure next to a small boy holding the teddy bear. The detail, although simple, caught the psychologist's attention. The pattern of repetition of the strokes indicated tension and fear, something far beyond a simple longing for Camila. As subjective evidence accumulated, tension also began to surround conversations between parents, especially within Donna Beatriz. She could no longer shake from her mind the feeling that she had made a terrible mistake, and that her son's suffering had much deeper roots than she had initially imagined. Ricardo's face appeared in his thoughts with disconcerting frequency. She remembered the countless times when her brother-in-law had suddenly appeared in the house, the way she insisted on playing with Lucas, even when the children were under. Camila's care, the forced smiles, the unnecessary touching, the crossed conversations that at the time seemed harmless, but now took on new meanings. Every detail that once seemed small and irrelevant now took on larger and more disturbing proportions. Donna Beatriz began to mentally revisit each of these moments, connecting them with her son's current suffering, with Lucas's anguished silence, and above all with the fact that Camila had never even had the chance to defend herself. As the therapy sessions progressed and suspicions grew inside that house, a new tension formed in the air, loaded with something dark that had not yet been completely revealed. The weight of truth began to press all involved, waiting for the inevitable moment, when finally, the words kept in Lucas's silence would gain voice. The day began with the same cautious routine as always. Lucas was taken once again to his therapy session, as had been happening in recent weeks. The psychologist received him with the same gentle welcome, that constant care not to pressure him, to offer security in an environment where little by little he had begun to let go in small gestures and looks, but still carried within himself a weight that seemed impossible to be fully expressed. That morning, however, there was a different, almost imperceptible air, as if something was about to happen without anyone yet knowing exactly what. While the session was going on, Lucas drew as usual. His features were still marked by those disturbing figures, by shadows larger than the small people who filled his papers. The psychologist, observing every detail with extreme attention, realized that the risks were more loaded, more intense. There was a different tension in his breathing, a tightness in his chest visible in the way he held the pencil, almost digging the tip into the paper. He seemed to be fighting an internal battle, as if his childish mind was finally trying to break through the barrier of fear. The indirect questions continued, guided precisely by the therapist's experience. She created hypothetical stories, talked about imaginary monsters, villains in the stories, situations that could cause sadness or fear in children. And at a certain moment, when one of these stories touched the sensitive point of who hurts, something inside Lucas seemed to give way. His eyes, until then fixed on the drawing, began to fill with tears. His little body began to tremble, and then, without being directly stimulated to speak, the words welled up, laden with a desperate, earnest cry, as if they had been stored too long within a space too small to contain them. The confession broke, the silence with brutal force. It wasn't Camila, it was the uncle. The uncle hurt him. The short, disconnected words carried a gigantic weight. In the innocent simplicity of that sentence, all the mystery that suffocated the house began to dissipate, revealing a scenario much darker and more painful than anyone there had imagined until then. Outside the room, Donna Beatriz, who was following the session through discreet observation through the glass window, felt her body freeze. Her son's words hit her like a dry blow to the chest. The air seemed to be missing for a few seconds. His hands trembled as he tried to lean on the nearby chair. His mind, in an overwhelming whirlwind, began to connect all the fragments that, until then, had seemed disconnected. Ricardo's frequent visits, the way he always appeared when there was no direct supervision, Lucas's looks, the inexplicable bouts of anxiety, the disturbing drawings, and now, that revelation that emerged with painful clarity. The pieces fit together at a cruel speed, forming an image that she refused to see until then. The brother, in whom he had blindly trusted, was not the protective presence he appeared to be. He had been responsible for all the suffering that devastated not only Lucas, but also Camila, who now appeared in Donna Beatriz's mind as the greatest victim of all that silent tragedy. The anonymous complaint, which at first seemed to come out of nowhere, now made sense in its origin. It had been a trap set to protect the real culprit, driving away the only person who could, even without knowing it, unmask him. Donna Beatrice's heart beat out of step as the cruel truth solidified within her. She felt overwhelmed by a mixture of guilt, regret, and revolt. He clearly remembered Camila's face, the pleas that went unheard, the tears she ignored as she chose to protect what she believed was the well-being of her children. Now he understood that by doing so, he had delivered his own son into the hands of those who should never have been close to him. Inside the room, the psychologist, maintaining the necessary calm so as not to interrupt the delicate flow of revelation, continued with her work, leading Lucas with soft words, helping him to expose little by little what had accumulated for months inside his childish mind. The boy, still sobbing, tried to explain with the limited vocabulary of his age, the moments of fear, the discomfort, the confusion he felt when his uncle appeared and approached without anyone being around. The professional wrote down every detail, aware of the gravity of what was being said, while little Lucas's face, although still filled with tears, began to relieve itself of a weight that he himself did not know how to carry alone. That which had paralyzed him for so long finally began to come out of him. It was the beginning of a long healing process, but for this to really happen, it would be necessary to still face the consequences of that overwhelming revelation. Outside, as the session continued, Donna Beatrice struggled to keep control of her own emotions. With each new word heard, the feeling that he had allowed a monstrosity to grow inside his house without realizing it made his breath shorter. The guilt was mixed with the fear of facing one's own omission, the shame of having rejected the young woman who had dedicated sincere love to her children, and above all the horror of thinking about everything her son had already endured in silence. The weight of that revelation would soon expand beyond the therapy room. Donna Beatrice knew in the depths of her soul that she could no longer maintain the silence that had prevailed until then. What had begun as a mere nuisance grew into doubt and now turned into suffocating certainty. There was still much to be confronted, and what was to come would be even more difficult to bear. The monster, until then hidden behind smiles and constant visitors, was now beginning to be exposed to light, and the consequences of this exposure would be profound and inevitable. The words spoken by Luke had been the fuse of an explosion that no one else could contain. From that moment on, the veil of silence and confusion that had shrouded the events finally began to tear. Donna Beatrice, taken by a force that even she did not know where it came from, knew that she could not postpone the inevitable. Confrontation was now an urgent necessity. Carrying that truth within oneself, without acting, would be like betraying one's own child once again. As I walked home, each step down the wide corridor seemed to echo the weight of what was about to happen. The elegant walls of the mansion, always so silent, now seemed to watch her, as mute witnesses of all that had been so long swept under the expensive carpets. Ricardo, as if nothing had happened, was in the room, with the calm confidence of someone who never believed he would be discovered. The easy smile, that same smile that had so often deceived, still hovered on his face when he was called for a private conversation. The first words thrown into the air were loaded with tension. Ricardo at first maintained a firm stance, vehemently, denying any accusation. His arguments came in fast waves, trying to protect himself with speeches of indignation and false innocence. She feigned surprise, tried to reverse the situation, questioning the child's sanity, insinuating that Lucas's memories were nothing more than typical confusions of her age. With each negative, his face gained an almost cynical glow, as if he believed he was controlling the game. But Donna Beatrice was no longer the same woman who one day closed her eyes to the signs. Now the details were before her with a clarity impossible to ignore. The psychologist's reports, the consistency of Lucas' behaviors, the son's terrified look, the disturbing drawings, and above all the child's own confession. Ricardo's defenses began to lose strength in the face of the growing solidity of the evidence. He realized that this time he would not be able to manipulate events as he had done before. The mask of confidence began to crack as new details emerged. The psychologist, armed with all the material gathered in the sessions, presented an extensive report that described Lucas's behavior pattern and the clear indications of trauma linked specifically to the figure of Ricardo. The document was thorough, substantiated, and removed any space for the superficial version that the aggressor tried to sustain. With the evidence accumulating overwhelmingly, Ricardo's denials became hesitations, then contradictions, and finally, uncomfortable silences. The emotional pressure increased like a rope tightening around the neck. Even Mr. Augusto, who until then had sought to maintain rationality in the midst of chaos, no longer hid his growing contempt for his brother-in-law. The words of indignation he now contained boiled in his mind, holding back the urge to move on to something more violent. But despite the revolt, he knew that it needed to follow the correct path of justice. With no way to sustain the lie, Ricardo finally gave in. What came out of his mouth was not exactly an honest confession, but a jumble of empty justifications, pathetic attempts to minimize the gravity of what he had done. He tried to paint his actions as misinterpreted jokes, as exaggerations of the child, still seeking, even in the end, to attenuate the unacceptable. But each word only increased the disgust and horror of those who heard him. There was no more room for doubt. With the confession, the case quickly took on greater proportions. The police were called, and the process took on the contours of a family scandal. What was previously restricted to the corridors of that mansion now became public, opening up what many would prefer to keep hidden. Ricardo was formally charged and taken to give testimony that would inevitably end up putting him behind bars. Justice, slow in many moments, now began to move its heavy gear against him. Inside the house, the shock was total. The family was faced with the emotional ruin of everything they once believed to be safe. The weight of guilt corroded mainly Donna Beatriz. She knew that she had been an unwitting accomplice in this tragedy, which, by not listening to Camila when it mattered most, contributed to the suffering of her own son and the destruction of the life of an innocent young woman. Remorse accompanied her in every gesture, in every thought, like an inseparable shadow. Little Lucas's gaze, although relieved to have finally taken that heavy secret out of him, still bore the mark of someone who had lived something much greater than he could understand. His road to recovery would be long. It would require patience, constant acceptance, and love. But at least now he was finally protected. He would no longer be haunted by the treacherous visits of those who should have been removed from the beginning. While the legal measures followed their course, a single idea began to dominate Donna Beatriz's thoughts. There was something that needed to be done, not as a way of relieving his own guilt, but as an acknowledgement of the unforgivable mistake he has committed. She needed to find Camila. I needed to face it, listen to it, ask for forgiveness, even though I knew that forgiveness might never come. It was not just a matter of repairing what happened, because some wounds never heal completely, but of at least trying to offer the young woman the truth that was always denied to her. It was a ransom not only from an unjust history, but also from a moral debt that now weighed on them all. Finding Camila became, for Donna Beatriz, the only possible way to face what they had become, to face the reflection that until then she had refused to see in the mirror. He knew that the search would be difficult. Camila disappeared from the map after the humiliation she suffered. Without family roots, with few resources and certainly traumatized by everything she experienced, it was difficult to know where to start. Even so, within that growing anguish, there was a new determination. As painful as it was, the only chance for some kind of reparation began with the reunion. And so, while the civil justice system did its job to hold the real aggressor accountable, the search for Camila took shape as a path of redemption that now needed to be walked at any cost. The weeks that followed the confrontation with the truth were dominated by a single objective: to find Camila. It was as if the whole weight of that story now demanded an inevitable reunion, a visceral need to repair, albeit belatedly, the harm caused. The search was not simple. Camila had left no visible trace. She had no family members, no contact history that could be consulted, and no support networks that would make it easier to locate her. She had disappeared not only from the life of the family, but almost from the city itself, like someone who, when wounded, hides in a dark corner of the world, trying to survive in the shadow of a still pulsating pain. Even with the difficulties, Donna Beatrice's determination did not give in. Every record, every possible clue, every name that came up, no matter how small the connection, was verified. He contacted Camila's former co-workers, spent hours in the archives of social institutions, where the young woman had been in her childhood, searched in remote neighborhoods, cross-referenced information with discreet consultations in shelters and simple pensions. That search became his daily routine, a kind of silent penance for his own blindness from the past. The sleepless nights, loaded with anxiety and guilt, became even longer when faced with the silence of the results. Sometimes, discouragement threatened to overcome her, but Lucas's gaze, still in the process of recovery, was enough to rekindle the urgency of that mission. The son was now safe, but he would forever carry the emotional marks of that trauma. Donna Beatrice knew that, in addition to taking care of her own son, there was another victim whose life had also been devastated. The young woman whom she herself condemned without listening, without allowing defense, without seeking the truth. It was after days of exhaustive attempts and countless closed doors that, finally, a concrete clue emerged. An employee of a former children's shelter recalled a young woman named Camila, who had commented on a modest boarding house where she could take temporary shelter. It was a discreet place in a remote neighborhood where people with few options sought to start over, away from the eyes and judgments. Without wasting time, the family headed there, Donna Beatrice's heart beating strong with each kilometer that brought them closer to their destination. The building was simple, with a worn facade and colors faded by time. The sign, already a little crooked, announced the name of the boarding house in faded letters. The room exuded an air of quiet loneliness, like a refuge for those who carried stories too difficult to tell. When the door was opened by an elderly lady, Camila's identification was immediate. She was still there, living modestly, keeping away from everything she once knew. The moment Camila's eyes crossed Donna Beatrice's, time seemed to stop. The seconds froze in a silence charged with everything that had never been said, with all the tears shed in separate worlds. Camila's face hardened for a moment, as if she needed a few seconds to assimilate what she saw. His heart was beating out of rhythm, the blood running hard through his veins. It was as if the past, which she had tried so hard to bury, had invaded that small, humble room, bringing with it the pain and the memory of everything she had suffered. Donna. Beatrice, taken by an overwhelming emotion, could not hold back her tears. He knelt before the young woman, begging for a forgiveness that he knew was almost impossible to receive. The words came out shaky and loaded with guilt, revealing to Camila the whole truth. He spoke of what Lucas had finally told in therapy, exposed in detail the monstrosity hidden behind the infamous accusation, confessed his own mistake in not having given her the opportunity to defend himself, to have tried and convicted her based on lies. The words flowed like a painful but sincere outburst from someone who now carried the crushing weight of his own failures. Camila remained silent for a few eternal seconds, her teary eyes fixed on Donna Beatrice. Every word she heard seemed to open even more the wounds she had been trying to heal since the day she was torn from that house. The pain, which never really left her, was now mixed with the bitter relief of finally being heard. The tears, inevitable, ran down the young woman's face, marking her face with the weight of everything that had been unfair. When he finally found the strength to answer, his voice came out choked but firm. She didn't need to scream. The words, charged with contained emotion, carried more force than any outburst of anger. There, in front of everyone, I said with the weight of someone who has carried truths for too long, "Now you know what I have, always known. But the pain, nobody erases this one." Those few words, spoken with the softness of someone who has cried too much to continue screaming, silenced everyone. It was a simple outburst, but full of meaning. She carried a faithful portrait of everything Camila experienced: abandonment, injustice, loneliness, the guilt that was never hers, the destruction of a life that could have followed another path, were it not for the cruelty that involved her. The meeting, although marked by so many intense emotions, did not bring a magic solution. The wound was still open, and the road to any kind of true reconciliation would still be long. Camila at Yaz. That moment was not sure if she would be able to or if she wanted to return to the life that was once taken from her. The invitation was implied in Donna Beatrice's tears, but the decision now belonged only to her. After being silenced for so long, she was finally the owner of her own story. The heavy air of that modest room seemed to carry the weight of years, full of pain, mistakes, and hidden truths. And even without a decision made there at that moment, a new chapter slowly began to form, still undefined, but loaded with the complexity that only a real and deep story could carry. Camila's story, marked by so much pain and injustice, quickly crossed the walls of that modest boarding house and reached the streets of the city. The unfolding of everything that had happened did not take long to gain space in the local newspapers, in the news and in the conversations of those who, until recently, did not even imagine the dimension of the tragedy that was hidden behind that mansion so admired from the outside. The story of a young orphan, falsely accused, publicly humiliated and estranged from the only family she had ever known, moved not only neighbors, but an entire community that now, belatedly, saw how cruelly she had been the victim of a system that did not give her a voice. The repercussion was inevitable. Camila's name has become synonymous not only with injustice, but also with strength and resilience. Television programs and investigative reports began to tell her story, and the images of that simple, steady-eyed young woman circulated widely, arousing the solidarity of many people. In the midst of all this exposure, opportunities also arose. Universities and educational institutions have offered scholarships, companies and social organizations have opened doors that would have been locked to him for the simple fact of carrying the weight of a difficult past. Camila, who until then had lived on the edge of survival, saw there not only a chance to start over, but the possibility of transforming all the pain she carried into something that could, in some way, make sense. The memories of childhood in shelters, lonely days in institutions, veiled prejudice and the absence of a real support network now became fuel for something greater. He then decided to accept one of the proposals that came to him, to enter the pedagogy course. He felt clearly that his destiny was directly linked to the children. He wanted to be for them what he once wanted so much to have, someone who would listen, who would welcome, who would protect. The years that followed were one of dedication and growth. Camila immersed herself in her studies with admirable discipline, absorbing each knowledge with the hunger of someone who understood in practice the weight and importance of what she was learning. She was not just an ordinary student. He was someone who carried in his own skin the marks of reality that many of his future students would face. This past made her even more sensitive and prepared to deal with the complexities of the work she chose to embrace. As the months progressed, new doors opened. Social projects, NGOs, and shelters began to invite her to actively participate in initiatives aimed at children in vulnerable situations. Every conversation, every story he heard, every little progress of a child who was previously invisible to the eyes of society strengthened his purpose even more. Camila not only rebuilt her life, but transformed her story into a mission, becoming a reference and inspiration for so many others who also carried open wounds. Her story, now public, went beyond the limits of the city and reached different places, touching people who, like her, had been victims of hasty trials, unfair accusations, or social abandonment. Camila had become a symbol of resistance, overcoming and, above all, courage. In the midst of this new path, the reunion with Lucas would happen in an unexpected but deeply symbolic way. Years after that day when everything fell apart, a charity event organized by one of the institutions in which Camila worked would serve as the stage for this new chapter. The presence of families served, volunteers and supporters filled the place with an atmosphere of hope and reconstruction. And it was in this scenario, illuminated by a new sense of belonging, that Lucas's eyes met once again with Camila's. The boy, now a little older, ran towards her without hesitation, with the same purity and confidence as before. His arms wrapped her in a tight embrace, charged with an affection that time could not weaken. The innocent scream, the one that echoed so much in her sleep when she was torn from her life, came out once again, this time without pain, only with the relief of a reunion that brought with it the lightness of a new beginning. That hug was more than a gesture of affection. It was the end of a cycle of pain, the living proof that, in spite of everything, true love had resisted every injustice, every silence and every tear. There, in that brief instant, was summarized all the strength of a story that, despite being marked by so much suffering, found its path of redemption. But even with this emotionally charged reunion, the outcome still waited for something more. The scars that Camila carried still bore deep marks, and the path to the complete reconstruction of her story still had more chapters to be written. Stories like Camila's show how courage and truth have a silent but immense power. Even when all seemed lost, it was precisely her strength in the midst of pain that paved the way for justice, for a new beginning, and for so many others who today find in her an example of hope. If this story touched you in any way, take advantage and leave it here in the comments. The truth always finds a way. So I will know that you have followed this far and that somehow this message has reached your heart. And if this type of story makes sense to you, subscribe to the channel. I always bring stories like this, which make us reflect, move, and believe a little more in the strength of overcoming. Oh, and of course, leave your like. It shows that we are connected and helps me keep bringing more content like this. There's a video here on the side that tells a similar story, full of exciting twists. Click and stay with me there.